From our headquarters in the Canadian Rockies, GLJ has spent more than 50 years amassing expertise and building successful partnerships with junior and multinational companies alike. We have a proven track record of advising on a wide variety of energy plays all around the world, helping propel the industry forward and improving client outcomes while solidifying our reputation as a leading evaluation company. Now, having grown to work with more than 300 clients each year, we've expanded our focus beyond conventional oil and gas amid the global energy transition. As the world moves to renewable energy, we've evolved our business to help our clients embrace change. We help government agencies, indigenous groups, clean tech companies, startups, and the financial and legal sectors understand and successfully navigate the future of energy. We know thoughtful collaboration and open communication enable innovative partnerships. It's how our company has become the trusted business it is today. Over the decades, we've honed our technical skills and industry knowledge while drawing insights from our client relationships to become one of the largest independent energy consulting firms in the world. We are global energy experts. We are GLJ.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate you carving out some time in your day to enjoy this session with us on GLJ. My name is Jodi Anhorn. I'm the president and CEO at GLJ, and joining me a little bit later on will be Devin Lacey, who is our senior business analyst. This is part of a subset of GLJ's Power Up seminars, which we've geared around industry topics of interest, some more general in nature, some very technical and specific. And today we're going to focus on the economics of carbon management and CCUS applications, primarily throughout the WCSB, and we'll also talk a little bit about the applications worldwide. We see carbon capture sequestration as a key technology to help us meet what's been described as the dual challenge. So this challenge can be summarized into the increasing requirement to grow and deliver reliable, affordable energy to the world while preserving and protecting our environment. At GLJ, we've made an Indigenous commitment several years ago, and as a small part of that, we would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that today I'm standing on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 in southern Alberta, and that the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So here's the problem. The world needs energy. Our use is growing steadily. No surprise, as energy drives economic growth and the standard of living. This graph here on the left-hand side simply shows the world consumption of energy over the last 25 plus years. And you see the local minimums observed in 2009 and 2020 just as brief hiccups. On the right-hand side, we see the share of primary energy being delivered from the variety of all sources. From here, we see the relative contribution from oil, I'll just doodle on this, declining with time. And we see coal has remained relatively steady. And the share delivered from natural gas continues to grow slightly. Another significant change we see here is that the strong growth of renewable energy supplies observed in the past 15 years, down here in the orange. This is obviously a result of considerable efforts in both public policy and capital expenditures to achieve this growth. Conversely, nuclear has been somewhat out of favor, you can see. But the key takeaway here is that the changing percentage has not come at the expense of overall reduction in fossil fuel use, which is shown on the left-hand side, where overall volumes clearly show continual growth from all energy sources. And the world clearly requires all energy sources to meet the varieties of needs and meet those challenges. Here we show what I like to call politics meets physics. So here we try to recognize that energy poverty is a real thing. Roughly 1/2 of the world's population needs additional access to reliable energy. After all, cheap, abundant energy is what has helped create our developed world. It drives not just GDP, as shown here, but life expectancy, higher literacy, fewer deaths from pollution, etc. But this energy use has also created environmental impacts that the industry needs to address, one such being GHG and CO2 emissions. This chart on the left-hand side shows that CO2 emissions tend to increase as the GDP increase for all nations across the world. On the right-hand side, we're showing how the world's growth in GHG emissions has shown a strong upward trend over the previous 2 decades. And it's now approaching 50 billion tons per year. What you do see in behind this total data, however, is that Canada and the US have actually been fairly successful in arresting our growth of GHG, and in fact has shown a decrease in the last 10-year period. Now, we've all heard in the recent press that the Canadian government has committed to a 40 to 45% reduction in our GHG emissions by 2030. That's relative to the 2005 levels, and the American government has committed to a huge reduction of 50% in that same time frame. So these are extremely aggressive reduction targets given that. Now, we've seen that the developed world has largely been successful in arresting its GHG emissions on the back of substituting coal electricity through the use of generation of natural gas, wind, and solar. Just look at Alberta as an example. Our coal plants have been decommissioned in a fairly rapid manner, and this low-hanging fruit now has been picked. We can only do that coal transition once. Meanwhile, other parts of the developing world continue to build huge coal infrastructure as it is a secure and affordable source for them. So this is a very complicated problem. It involves technical, societal, and economic impacts. If all we do is solve for one variable, such as reduce GHG to zero, we can do immense harm elsewhere. Look, for example, to the issues within Europe on energy security and affordability, or perhaps even just California. These are jurisdictions that felt that they could afford to force this change with politics and policy. And it's been a very difficult reckoning for them through 2021 and 2022. Expensive energy hits all industries and will eventually find its way into huge price increases both in food and heating, along with other basic requirements of life. Now, on the other side, energy poverty world certainly can't afford this transition. They need better solutions. And regardless, any properly planned energy transition will take us decades to achieve. So the question is, how can we use existing reliable energy sources in a more responsible way? We feel that carbon capture, utilization, and storage is readily available. It's scalable and potentially economic process that we can really dig into and learn more about. So here's our agenda for this session. We're going to briefly describe the CCUS process and state of the industry update. Then we're going to walk through some of the specifics as a case study here in the Alberta CCS market. We'll talk about the application process, some of the carbon pricing considerations. Then we'll dive into the detailed economic models that we've prepared for 3 different CCUS applications. Then we'll close it off with a quick walkthrough on the requirements and benefits for creating saline aquifer storage models. Hopefully wrap this up in just a little over an hour. So, quick on us first. It's always nice to know a little something about the background of the speakers. So let me give you a quick intro to GLJ. We're a leading energy consulting firm. We're now celebrating our 50th year anniversary here in 2022. Our team's roughly 100 people and very strong in the technical and economic world, comprised of engineers, geoscientists, sustainability, and business professionals. Most people that know of us would know us from our traditional roots in reserve and resource evaluations, which we've conducted worldwide, working within 60 countries in the last 10 years and delivering more than 13,000 projects in that time frame. What many don't know about us is that we have extensive work in the emerging energy and sustainability realm. Today, we'll dive into our skills in the CCUS space, but on top of that, we help our clients solve problems in the sustainability and ESG space more in general, along with detailed economic studies in geothermal, elemental lithium, helium, and hydrogen. And these areas, have informed some of our earlier webinars that we planned here in 2022 as well. So a number of sustainability roadmaps we've built to help clients assess where they are and what actions they could take to improve their ESG reporting related to other issues such as RSG, which is responsibly sourced gas. So we've done work in subsurface screening studies, subsurface modeling, simulation. We work with our clients on government pore space applications, everything from project scoping to the direct applications themselves. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Jodi, if you were to ask me, what is CCS? This is what I'd be able to tell you. First off, it's a fairly simple 3-stage process. The first is simply the separation of CO2 from other gases that are produced in industrial processes. This could be upstream natural gas-fired plants, could be coal, could be steel mills, could be cement, etc. The important piece there is that we're now capturing the CO2 from what was previously vented into the environment in the flue process. The second stage is simply, once separated, the CO2 is compressed and transported. This can be done typically via pipelines, but you could also use trucks or ships to take it to the final storage space. And then the storage element is simply that, where we compress and inject the CO2 into deep underground rock formations, usually at a depth of about 1 kilometer or more. Now, if the carbon is also utilized as part of that permanent storage, we add the U and we call it CCUS. So here's a quick graphical presentation of what I just described. So on the top left, we show with the blue beaker, there's a pre-combustion chemical process. So in this case, we're showing fertilizer, could also be hydrogen production, but the one shown right here is an H2 creation process where we start with natural gas and air as our input streams, goes through a steam methane reformation process. We end up with an output of hydrogen for sale and CO2 as a byproduct. And on the bottom left, shown in the red, is a post-combustion process where we combust natural gas and air to create heat, generate electricity with CO2 and the flue gas as a byproduct that we need to deal with now. And many other types of industrial processes typically will fit into one of these either two bins, depending on the type of process it is, and that will obviously impact the CO2 capture technology. So what does this look like in the real life? So here in Alberta, we've got a couple of really good examples that we want to point to. The first, shown up here in the top right, this area, is the ACTL, or the carbon trunk line. So this is an amazing piece of infrastructure that's been built here in Canada through the 2010s and now is up and operational. It's designed at full capacity to transport up to nearly 15 million tons of CO2 per year, currently only operating at just under slightly 10% utilization. So in this process, which starts just north of Edmonton in the industrial heartland area, CO2 is captured from two industrial processes, first being the Northwest Refinery and the other being the Nutrien fertilizer plant. That CO2 after capture is then compressed and transported 240 kilometers via that pipeline that's shown there in blue down to central Alberta. Currently, the CO2 that's being used there is subsequently permanently stored in the Enhance Energy Clive EOR project, which we'll speak a little bit more on later. So that's a very large piece of infrastructure that we'll describe a little bit on. The second I want to talk about is shown here in the star, up in that area, similar source area just north of Edmonton. And this is the Alberta Quest CO2 storage project operated by Shell. Here, the CO2 is captured from the Scotford steam methane reformer unit, which produces hydrogen for upgrading bitumen. Typical capture using amine technology that we've known for decades. And there, the CO2 is transported a much shorter 60-kilometer route to the injection and storage hub. Again, we'll speak about each of these a little bit more later in this webinar. Now, with that done, I'll turn it over to Devin. He's got some examples to kind of put those projects in scale worldwide.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Jodi. As Jodi mentioned, my name is Devin Lacey. I'm the Senior Business Analyst with GLJ, here to present in partnership with Jodi today. So as Jodi had just finished covering, we're not strangers to CCS deployments here in Western Canada. We have 5 of the 26 operational facilities globally, and they're identified here in the Global CCS 2001 Status Report under their respective categories of capture point. So those categories consist of power generation, hydrogen production, fertilizer production, and chemical production categories. And so we see the Boundary Dam and Great Plains projects that are injecting CO2 into the Weyburn and Mydale oil fields in southeast Saskatchewan. So that's these 2 projects here. We also see in Alberta 3 projects with the Shell Quest that Jodi had just went over, represented here, and the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line with CO2 offtake at both the Sturgeon Refinery and the Nutrien fertilizer plant. What's also interesting to note in this global overview is the increasing size of the projects that are currently under development, with many in the 5 million ton per year capacity of scale. So a significant scaling up of projects as the technology and overall demand for CCS solutions advances. And here's just that previous table overlaid on a global map where we see the majority of operational facilities, as well as facilities that are under development, are located in the US. Most of the Canadian CCS development is happening in Alberta and the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, with quite a lot of projects that are blue or that are under development within Europe and the North Sea. And so, as Jodi had also alluded to, CCS has an important role to play in decarbonizing a number of different sectors throughout the energy transition. This graphic here is courtesy of the IEA's 2021 report projecting pathways to a global net zero energy sector in 2050. So this scenario is, quite an aggressive decarbonization scenario, projecting pretty rapid movement away from fossil fuels. But even so, the remaining use of fossil fuels requires considerable CCS application. So the point we really kind of aim to highlight here is that this is a relatively aggressive scenario of fossil fuel decline. However, CCS still projects at exponential growth rates, whereas in a less aggressive fossil fuel decline scenario, CCS is likely to become more important as to manage those additional emissions across global energy systems. Again, within this net zero scenario, CCS deployments are projected to grow at approximately 20% annually over the next 30 years, as capacity grows from about 40 million tons per year today to nearly 8,000 million tons per year, or 8 gigatons of CO2 per year in 2050. So this growth is largely driven by the enhanced production of biofuels, hydrogen, and other low carbon fuels here in this category. It's also driven by CCS in industries such as cement, steel, fertilizers, chemical and petrochemical production. So areas where electrification is quite difficult as an abatement strategy. And it's also used primarily quite a bit in the decarbonization of existing fossil fuel-based power systems, as we can kind of see here in this final section. And just to kind of illustrate the more short-term projections, we're already actually beginning to see the considerable growth projections that we saw in that previous slide start to come to fruition, where we've seen a 48% year-over-year increase in total CCS capacity from 2020 to 2021. And that's been driven by about 35 million tons of new project capacity that's moved into the early development phase over that time. These projects announcements, they're very much largely representative of an increasing recognition by industry and governments of CCS's critical role within decarbonization. CCS now appears in 83% of long-term low emissions and development strategies, or LEDSs, which are actually submitted under Article 4 of the Paris Agreement and dictate how, in fact, national governments will deliver on their emissions reduction commitments. Jodi has some more detailed actually review when it comes to CCS subsurface site selection, but here's just a general high-level overview from the 2021 Global CCS Status Report that clearly identifies the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin as highly suitable storage potential, and that really serves as the critical feasibility factor to enabling large-scale regional demand for CO2 sequestration, is the ability to have that geology and that pore space. And so we start to put everything together in a more holistic type of model, where we see in regions with both high demand potential for CO2 capture, as well as that highly suitable storage space. That's where CCS hubs begin to provide a model for efficient and effective large-scale regional decarbonization potential. And we've seen this firsthand in Alberta with enabling infrastructure such as the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. There's very much a if you build it, they will come type of mentality with this enabling infrastructure. The CCS hub model is what the Alberta government is also quite focused on with their current ongoing pore space application process. And again, that's something that's ongoing and that we'll review in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. But where CCS hubs offer the enabling infrastructure, it really allows industries can then seriously have a look at their operations and see how they can fit within this hub for reaching the decarbonization and sustainability targets. Okay, and we are soon coming to evaluating some project economics, but first we wanted to really kind of take a deeper dive into the Alberta CCS landscape in particular, because at the end of the day, CCS economics are very dependent on the specific drivers, advantages, or disadvantages of the geographic location that they're developed in. So for the project cases that we're going to be assessing in a little while, our projects are Alberta based, so we wanted to highlight that what the landscape looks like right now, so you can really kind of set the stage for those evaluations, and so you have an idea of our assumptions and our estimates that are built into those cases. So starting just with some policy and regulation history we have here. This is a quick high-level overview of a timeline of provincial policy and regulation updates that we've seen in the last 10 years, which again just goes to reiterate that we are not totally new to this. There were a lot of pre-2010 studies that were done in addition to these, and that really led to a lot of industry buzz back then, and kind of culminated with the major announcements of Alberta Carbon Trunkline and Quest funding commitments here in 2010, 2011. And then we kind of seen things peter out a little bit in terms of action and policy updates throughout the early 2010s or mid 2010s, but this has very much been rekindled over the last 2 years in particular. Again, we won't get into detail on each of these, but we did want to provide this link here to Open Alberta, and we suggest that you visit that website. A lot of great open source publications. We just kind of gave a little hint here. If you put carbon capture into the search bar, it should provide you about 53 direct results, and that includes things like fully publicly available annual summary reports from Quest, annual summary reports from the Alberta Carbon Trunkline, as well as all the relevant quantification protocols. So a great resource. And just in reference to the renewed buzz around CCS in Alberta that we have been seeing, and not just in Alberta, but really throughout North America and throughout the industry as a whole globally. But here's kind of what we're seeing day to day in our headlines, just kind of with these really major project announcements in the news today. So just kind of starting with one of the bigger ones, which is the Oil Sands Pathway to Net Zero initiative, including major operators such as CNRL, Cenovus, Imperial, MEG, Suncor, and ConocoPhillips. And their focus is developing a CCUS trunk line or a CCS hub that can serve the Cold Lake region where their operations tend to be located. The second one here we see is Entropy, and they're actually more on the technology side of things. So Entropy is a subsidiary of Advantage, and their focus is developing a post-combustion capture technology that uses solvent-based technology, but really kind of enhancing on what we already know there, optimizing that for improved operations and costs. Then we also have more infrastructure announcements such as Pembina and TC Energy looking to develop an Alberta carbon grid to really service massive scale of about 20 million tons of CO2 per year on the capacity side. Shell Polaris, again, Shell, that is a player here that we're well familiar, has a familiarity with CCS. They're looking to develop yet another project within the area of interest of Quest. So really within that same region, looking to possibly scale that up to a 300 million ton per year capacity. And then we're looking at ACO and Suncor, whose CCS interests are really focused on blue hydrogen and blending hydrogen with natural gas infrastructure in the Fort Saskatchewan area. Again, this is just a portion of lots of what we're seeing out there today. It's a really active space. And here's what we're just seeing more specifically for some of the leading CCS demand applications, not only here in Alberta, but this has a lot of crossover with other regions such as the U.S. Gulf Coast, which is something we'll have a look at also. But we're seeing the high applicability in areas, as you can imagine, such as upstream within the E&P world, decarbonizing power and steam operations, across the midstream world, and into refineries where there's quite a high hydrogen demand for cracking bitumen and upgrading. So they're looking to actually transition existing gray hydrogen to blue hydrogen through CCS application. There's also, in general, a expanded hydrogen, ammonia, methanol production landscape with a rising interest in low-carbon fuels. And then, like we've mentioned earlier, addressing high-emitting industrial sectors where in Alberta those really tend to be fertilizer and petrochemical production. And like I said, we're not the only ones talking about this. This is an example from the Gulf Coast Coalition looking at CCS, and that this is a projection of CCS integrated within their operations, and it really kind of represents a high potential regional solution for them for the processes there that are very difficult to abate through electrification. So things such as like gas processing, hydrogen production, ammonia production. These are kind of problem areas that are high emitters yet difficult to electrify. And so they're currently a leading region for deployments, and based on this projection, they tend to want to build on that. But what's really kind of an amazing statistic here is that this projection of 1,400 million tons per year, 1.4 gigatons per year that you see them capturing in 2035, that actually makes up about 25% of the total US GHG emissions, based on what Jodi mentioned earlier at that 5.8 billion ton per year mark. So if they are able to achieve this type of abatement through CCS, it represents about a 25% reduction in overall US emissions. I'm now going to hand it back to Jodi to take us through a bit more of a deep dive on what it is to go through the site selection process for subsurface storage.
Okay, thank you, Devin. So now that our interest is peaked and we want to look into some potential CCUS projects to support our operations, now we can begin some of the technical work. So first off, a key consideration is obviously that of proper site selection. This graphic is just an illustration to show the key factors to be considered in any CO2 storage site. The example shown here is that within a saline aquifer reservoir. So the first consideration we think about is the capacity. So what is the estimated total storage capacity within the defined region? Usually we have broad parameters on this at a fairly early stage and can make some fairly informed estimates around the overall capacity. Second then is injectivity. So what's our ability to actually inject CO2 at reliable rates? This can be much more difficult to know early on, as we don't often have very good porosity permeability information at early stages. The third key issue is that of containment. Do we have full containment of the injected fluids within the area of interest, or do we have seal or potential migration issues to deal with? Also, we need to think about things like vent losses to existing wellbores, and this becomes much more difficult when you combine it with the ongoing regulatory monitoring that's going to be required for the life of these fields. And then the fourth one that we include seems obvious, obviously, is that you need to own and control this pore space. Now, this is an evolving issue across many jurisdictions, and we're going to address this a little bit later on in our Alberta case study, but that obviously is a key consideration that you need to worry about with any of the fields you're going to look at. So we'll walk now through some examples of sites that were selected and or under construction and why this is. So one of the most established use of CO2 sequestration within North America is that of enhanced oil recovery schemes. We have well over 100 of these operational across North America. So the one we show here is that of the Clive operation, which is at the south end of the Alberta carbon trunk line. So here, CO2 is injected along with water to improve the overall oil recovery that's observed in the field. Here we show it connected to the Clive field, which has two separate horizons that it injects into, the Leduc and the Nisku, and it obviously is being utilized for EOR and carbon sequestration. This field is a great example. It's the anchor field and chosen because the volumes delivered to it are from the ACTL down to the operator enhanced energy. These reservoirs are excellent targets for this technology. They possess great characteristics of capacity, injectivity, and containment. So here we see the ACTL has the ability to deliver CO2 to many other fields along the length of the route. And this is the most common use of the U in CO2 when we discuss CCUS projects. Now we'll look at some opportunities that exist within depleted gas reservoirs, specifically here now in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. This is a high-graded table over here on the right, just on this list, which shows potential reservoirs that score really well on the site selection criteria. So many of these are legacy gas fields that are surrounded by existing infrastructure. These are typically large fields, highly depleted, and they possess large CO2 storage capacity at the appropriate reservoir conditions. We know a lot of information about these fields. They've been studied for years. There's very good porosity, permeability information. So the uncertainty on this type of an application is much less risky. And here we just highlight the top 10 fields, and you look to see there's a capacity in the range of 70 to 190 million tons of CO2 storage in any one of them. So very significant in aggregate. And you can see them then located geographically on the map on the left, just relative to Edmonton. So we'll pluck a couple of those out as an example in a second, but the question becomes, how do you potentially sort through thousands of these reservoirs across a diverse basin? So here we show BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. So what we've done at GLJ, we've utilized a spot fire screening dashboard, kind of allows us to provide the appropriate filters to make sense of all this information. We determine such key items such as reservoir size, which obviously is a direct correlation to CO2 storage potential. We have data around pressure, depth, poroperm, along with fluid characteristics and acid gas composition. So by appropriately looking for minimums or maximums for what you need, along with the appropriate filters, it allows you to sort through a large volume of potential reservoirs to highlight the ones you're most interested in. And of course, in this type of a geographical presentation shown here on the left, it does allow you to focus on regions of interest that might be within certain operational distances of your facilities or planned facilities. Really allows you to focus your attention on the key reservoirs that meet your appropriate criteria. And in this example, we show it just highlighting to the top up to gas reservoirs and down in the bottom into oil reservoir subsets. So now, using that tool, here's one that kind of jumps out at us as a good example of a depleted gas pool that scores really highly on a lot of these metrics. This is the Racinus West field example. So this is a Leduc Devonian pool, which has produced 98% of its original 1.8 TCF of gas. And from approximate math, it gives us the math that we could provide up to about 98 million tons of permanent CO2 storage. So lots of positives going for this one. It's regionally compact. It's a well-defined structure. It's obviously thick. We know that there's good seal and containment issues. And it's also the ongoing monitoring issues are somewhat minimized due to the low number of wells that are actually penetrating this reservoir. Which is obviously a very positive for it. Now, this field was also rated for sour gas operations already. Now, in fields like this, and this is an example, there have been concerns historically raised about induced seismicity in areas like this. So more work is clearly required, but it does allow you to really sort in and cherry pick a little bit and do your analysis on the fields that look to be really good targets for developing CCS. Now we'll move on to an example of a deep saline aquifer used for CO2 storage. In this case, we're going to show the Basal Cambrian Sandstone. So this is the reservoir that is currently utilized at the Alberta Quest project. This saline aquifer is extensive across the WCSB. However, the well control and the data on this formation is pretty sparse, generally underlies all of the hydrocarbon reservoirs of interest that we've developed for. So there's not a lot of well penetrations and information yet. So additional study is required in the area that we may point to originally. But if the BCS is present in many areas across Western Canada, why was this Alberta Quest site chosen? So this next slide speaks to that a little bit. So again, we know that this aquifer isn't equal everywhere across the WCSB. And some areas we have better data than others. But this area was chosen for a reason. Once you get in here, you do realize there's very good thickness, very good porosity, permeability relationships, and all of that was confirmed with 3 modern well logs that were acquired. And that's public information that's shown here. And you see a nice thick package, good porosity distribution from top to bottom, a really nice target zone for injection. And as you can't quite see perhaps on the scale, but that red area that's shown over here is the large area of interest defined by the Quest project, and those are large townships. So this is a very extensive area that was shown here for this project. Now, as you move south, the indications are that you might lose a little bit of this porosity permeability that's so attractive here. And as you move east, it looks like perhaps there's a thicker BCS isopack, but more of an unknown quality as we're kind of lacking some of that key data. So again, we'll come back to this area of interest later as we take a little bit deeper dive into the subsurface of Quest. Here's a hybrid example with some EOR potential and a very large, extensive underlying aquifer. This is the Redwater Field, just located outside of Edmonton. Sits up dip, if you see on this cartoon over here on the left-hand side. There's a massive cooking lake, Leduc aquifers down in these areas. This provides the operator with the ability to inject CO2 and receive the benefit of an EOR flood up in this region, while also utilizing the deep saline aquifer volumes for injection and additional permanent CO2 storage below. So that's a great opportunity. Redwater, however, is at a relatively shallow depth and thus lower pressure conditions. Hinders our ability somewhat to inject high density CO2 at increased pressures. And also, one other interesting thing here is just note the vertical well penetrations over here. This is an actual Petrel model we've built on it, and obviously every one of those penetrations has the capacity to be a potential lack or containment issue. So it does increase your measuring, monitoring, and verification, or your MMV considerations. All of that's achievable. However, it's incremental testing and monitoring dollars to consider as you go forward. So with that said, that's just some quick walkthroughs. I'll turn it back to Devin here to discuss some of the key economic drivers.
Thanks, Jodi. So as I had sort of reiterated a little earlier, our intent during this section of the presentation in particular is to outline the Alberta-specific CCS factors to kind of set the stage for our economic case overview. So Jodi had just taken us through the available storage supply in the province and how the site selection process works. And prior to that, we had touched on some of the leading demand applications in the province. The last thing that we want to go over before getting into the project cases are the primary revenue drivers for CCS projects, and that's carbon credits. All right, so carbon credits, those carbon credit regimes tend to vary quite significantly across jurisdiction. In Alberta, we have a carbon credit market regulated under the tier regulation, where as of January of 2022, the carbon credit value is $50 per ton of CO2 reduction against your tier registered emissions baseline. There are two types of credits under the tier system. There's an emissions offset credit and an emissions performance credit, but both are worth the same value at that $50 per ton CO2 level. In the interest of time, I'm not going to dive any deeper into EOCs and EPCs and how each of those registries tend to work or function, but all that information is available on openalberta.com. It's also available at the registry websites. So then next on the list here, we have the Clean Fuel Regulation, which comes into effect in December of 2022, and it's going to require suppliers of liquid fossil fuels in particular to gradually reduce their carbon intensity through the value chain. So the CFR, or Clean Fuel Regulation, we don't have insight or clarity into how that's going to apply to CCS projects yet. So as we do await clarity on that, we don't include that incentive or that credit within our economic evaluations. Last but not least here, we have the discussion happening around CCS investment credits through CCS specific tax credits to help alleviate the very high capital burden associated with the projects. In the States, this already exists in the form of what's called the 45Q tax incentive credit, which was enacted in February of 2018 and allows registered organizations to capture carbon from their operations and earn $50 per ton of CO2 stored permanently. And they actually also have a partial credit of $35 per ton of CO2 that's used in enhanced oil recovery or other such utilizations. This sort of tax incentive credit is currently underdeveloped in Canada. So as we do await the specifications on that, we also exclude them from our economic evaluations. And the carbon pricing regimes and the associated regulation, we wanted to kind of step outside of Alberta for a minute and just show that this is happening on a global scale. This is 2020 statistics, but as of this model, 49 countries had a CO2 pricing initiative enacted or had a jurisdiction with one enacted, and that covers 80% of global GDP in terms of those countries. There's also 75 countries with net zero targets, as well as over 30 countries now with hydrogen strategies that tend to be quite a driver for CCS development also. And so the final piece of policy that we wanted to look at before kind of diving in is the ongoing pore space application process that I brought up earlier, currently ongoing from the government of Alberta. So this process is specific to CO2 injection for permanent sequestration into what would currently be Crown-owned pore space, namely deep saline aquifers. Where existing regulations exist for other forms of CO2 injection, such as acid gas injection or enhanced oil recovery, those processes will remain under those respective standards and processes. And so the flow chart at the bottom here is how they've kind of rolled out this process for applying for the Crown-owned pore space. Back in the fall of 2021, there was an expression of interest phase, or an EOI phase, and that was really for the government to gather preliminary project proposals and form an understanding of the industry demand for storage space. This EOI phase was not a prerequisite for participation in the next phase, which is called the Request for Full Project Proposals, or the RFPP phase. The RFPP calls are currently being issued in stages based on where the CCS proposed projects will source their emissions from. So that's an important distinguishing factor. It's not based on the region that you want to put your storage hub, but it's based on the region that you're going to source your emissions from. So the first RFPP round was issued to support emissions being sourced from the Alberta Industrial Heartland, and the second round actually just kicked off on March 3rd, 2022, and it's aimed at servicing emissions from all other remaining regions across the province. And this RFPP round actually closes on May 2nd. So if your full project proposal is accepted, you may be awarded an evaluation permit from your area of interest so that you can drill and appraise that pore space. From there, if all goes according to expectation, you may be awarded a carbon sequestration agreement to own and operate the storage hub for either your own emissions, third-party emissions, or both. Again, if you do want more information on this process, you can visit the link here at the bottom. And now we are finally at putting it all together, right? So we're going to put it all together from capture to storage and look at the economic cases.
Okay, thanks, Devin. So we're ready to move on. So here's my impression of the conversation you and your boss had recently, and thus sparked your interest in our topic, right? We have a CO2 problem. What's it going to cost to fix it? So we've reached a section here where Devin and I have put in the real work for this presentation, and we're happy to show you the results of some of this. We're just simply trying to answer that question. What will it cost, and really, who will pay for it? So what we've done in this case is we've created 3 separate cases to investigate the economics of carbon capture and storage. These are real-world conditions and economic models that we've built for discussion. So these 3 cases are, the first one's fairly simple. It essentially goes along with the Government of Alberta RFPP process that Devin discussed there. What we have here is just simply an injection and storage hub set up in a bit of a regional utility model. That's the one I'll go into detail on next, so I'll just quickly share what the other 2 are. The second one builds upon that, where we now have a post-combustion natural gas CO2 recovery. After that, then we have the pipeline transport and storage hub. And then the final one is a bit of a new project where we'd have a blue hydrogen scope. So this is a fully integrated CCS value chain with hydrogen production. We'll spell out all the details of these coming on nextly. So first, case A. So this is a case that we wanted to introduce that's fairly easy for everyone to understand. And then Devin will follow up with descriptions of B and C later. So case A, simple setup where we have a CO2 transportation and storage hub without the consideration of capture. So in this case, the CO2 is delivered to your field gate and you provide the utility of transportation and storage for a service fee. So in this case, you see the costs are the transportation and storage hub capital and ongoing operating expenses. And your revenue stream essentially is just that of the service fee. So it's a bit of a utility rate for the CO2 offtake. We have included some very modest grants, which you'll see in here don't really add up to much, but we know there will be some appropriate to be included. And then these costs also will include full abandonment, decommissioning, and reclamation at the end of the project. And as mentioned, B and C will go into when we set those up. So here's the details on case A. So here's the model. We have a CO2 injection storage hub, roughly 65 kilometers of a CO2 pipeline that you will transport once you take possession of the CO2. With that, then we've included capital for 3 injection wells, 3 deep monitoring wells, and 3 groundwater monitoring wells. The design has been set up for the injection and storage of about 1.25 million tons of CO2 per year and a 25-year operating life. So why did we choose these specs? Well, this is the scale and the scope that's very similar to that of the Alberta Quest facility. So the key being here that we're looking at this economically post-capture. So we are not including the cost of capture at this stage. So the capital and operating costs we used here are real-world costs, and they're relatively well-defined. And this includes guidance from the operator publicly that they have regarding future cost reductions. And also of note here that our input costs and output costs are all considered in Canadian dollars at roughly the going rate of 80 cents Canadian to US. Now, with that one scenario, we've built up, with one case A, we built up 4 scenarios of different value for fee for service. So what would your revenue stream look like if you were generating $20 per tons of CO2 you sequester, and then $30, $40, and $50 tons? And again, potential clean fuel standard credits and CCS tax credits are not applied in any of these cases, just for simplicity. So what does that look like? To make this illustrative, obviously here we're showing the calculations of a future cash flow stream. And we're going to show these before tax and without financing considerations included, just to keep it as simple as possible. So here you see all the main components that you would expect in your cash flow analysis. So capital is seen here in gray in the first 6 years as you design, construct, and finish off your feed components. And here's the tiny amount of credit that's provided on the federal grant side, so very small. And then after that, we start to see the green bar, which now represents revenue as you take possession of the CO2, transport it, and sequester it. Offsetting that in the orange bars down here are the operating costs year over year to maintain and operate your facilities. And at the very end of life, there's about 3 years here where we've spread out the abandonment reclamation costs that will be required to cease production from this facility. So with all that in mind, what we show now in the dark black line here, which dips low and then starts to climb up, obviously we reach a low point where all the capital is being spent prior to any revenue. And then after that, we see the cumulative cash flow begin to climb. And right about year 14 on this example, we reach project payout. So in an undiscounted, simple analysis, we have 14 years of payout. Now, if we discount our future cash flow stream by 10%, that's what's shown here in this lighter dashed line. And in fact, you can see we never quite reach payout at discounted at 10%. So when you look at all your key economic parameters over here on side, there's the payout at 14 years we talked about. The internal rate of return that we see is 9.2%, which makes sense. It's just under 10%, as we showed. But the NPV of this project, undiscounted, is $506 million. And if you discount it at 10%, it's a negative $3 million. We also show the profit investment ratio here at 10% of 0.95. So what this shows you is that you've got a project which does break even in an undiscounted sense, but not at a discounted 10 cents. So it's reasonably attractive. It's certainly an interesting project at this level. And I should have noted earlier, but this is our scenario 2 case. This is our $30 per ton revenue stream case. So you can see at around that level of revenue generated for your CO2 that you sequester, it starts to become economically interesting. So that's all good. Those are all done deterministic. We've used our best estimates for capital costs and operating costs to get there. Now, we all know we live in the real world where there's uncertainty in those estimates. We have a good capital number, we have a good operating cost number, but what we've done is we've taken this model a little further and built it out in a probabilistic or a stochastic case. So here now we have a level of uncertainty provided for all of those key issues of capital costs, the fixed operating expenses, and the variable operating expenses. So by doing that, obviously that does allow us then to see how uncertain the outcome is in all of these economic forecasts. So again, for clarity, this is just showing visually what we've done. In this case, we show a couple key model inputs and the variability of those inputs. And then obviously we get outputs from our economic model that obviously do reflect that uncertainty as well too. So in this case, we show NPV 0 and NPV 10. Internal rate of return is there, the PIR, and the payback period. So what it shows now is it allows us to show in the probability case what are our economic indicators from this type of a development. So what do we get when we do all that work? So here's that same scenario 2, $30 per ton CO2. So here is our deterministic case, ends up being almost exactly the same as our P50 outcome, which is what we'd expect given the math that we've implied in here. So just a slightly negative NPV 10 number. But now you see at a P90 case, so that 9 out of 10 outcomes will be better than this. We achieve an NPV 10 of negative 69 million, and it does show a P10 of positive 41 million, which says that only 1 out of 10 times will we actually exceed this outcome. So that's really interesting. I think it does show us now what the sensitivity to some of these inputs are and the resulting outcome. So this is all shown on the left-hand side on your cumulative density function, and up here on the right is the similar information but just shown in a histogram format, which some people are more comfortable with. And from here you can see here's your P90 outcome and your P10 outcome and the resulting minimums and averages shown in there. So that's all good. And in the bottom right half side of this chart, we show your sort of classic tornado or sensitivity analysis, which shows you what are the more key input parameters in determining the sensitivities of these outcomes. And what you see here is that the capital costs, the multiplier on those capital costs is actually more significant in this case to the multiplier on the variable operating expenses. But again, let's just drive down into the analysis of what is more important on the economic indications. So that was all done with the $30 per ton case. Now what if we look at the other scenarios? So here is what we were just talking about. This is scenario 2 at $30, the one we showed. Now in blue we see $20, which is obviously more uneconomic. And then as we step up to the case where you receive $40 in red and $50 per ton in dark blue or purple, you see it becomes much more economically interesting. So we're here where we were slightly negative NPV 10 at $30, we now have an outcome that is much more positive, NPV10 at $40 a ton. And similarly, you see the outcomes then at the top right and bottom right that we saw before. But now you can see how sensitive we are to the assumption or to the fee that you would need to charge for this sort of a utility to put away and transport CO2. Now just a quick look at the other economic indicators. So here's the IRR we had determined at our base case, essentially at $30 per ton. That was just under 10%. Now we see if we start charging $40 per ton, the internal rate of return climbs much higher, up into the mid-teens in this range. And if we charge $50 a ton, we're much higher into the high teens, probably 17 or 18% rate of return. So it's interesting to note, obviously, that it's very sensitive to the revenue side, which isn't a surprise to anybody. And you need to keep in mind, too, that this is a little bit more of a utility style of facility we'd be talking about here. A little bit lower risk in terms of fee and revenue variation than you might have on a true, like if you were looking at rates of return for an exploration development, for example, you would need much higher rates of return to become interesting. But in a utility world, this is perhaps interesting already. Okay, on this chart now, we show the payback time for these various scenarios. The base case we've been looking at $30 per ton here yields 14 years. And as we move up into more positive economic area with $40 a ton, that payback time drops considerably here to 11 years. And then at $50 a ton, it drops even further down to about 9 years. And again, you can see the distribution now of the payback time in the top right-hand chart. So that was our case A example. I'm going to turn it over to Devin now to walk us through case B.
Okay, so on to case B, where we're now adding a post-combustion solvent-based capture system to an existing natural gas-fired power generation facility. In addition to that, we're still including the full downstream infrastructure that Jodi had just reviewed in case A. So within these economics and within the scope, we still include the CO2 pipeline and the injection and storage hub. But we are now assuming that the same owner is capturing their own emissions, transporting it via their own pipeline infrastructure, and storing it in their own storage hub. So the added costs for the post-combustion capture facility and the associated CO2 dehydration and compression system are what really make up the majority of the added costs and added scope here. The main revenue stream is now the earning of carbon credits instead of the charging of a CCS service fee like we saw in case A. And so here are the credits that are going to drive our scenarios for case B. We have a $50 per ton CO2 carbon credit, which actually equates to today's carbon credit within the Alberta carbon credit tier market. We're also going to be looking at a $75 per ton scenario, $100 per ton scenario, and a scenario where we advance the carbon credit to $170 by 2030, and then we just escalate it by inflation from 2030 onward, and this is in line with the federally projected announcement of carbon credit values. So on case B, we're just going to jump right into looking at the internal rate of return distribution across all four of the scenarios. So we see a P50 return in the $100 per ton carbon credit scenario of about 7 to 8%. So that's this red line here. And I'm looking at the $100 per ton case, which is actually doubled today's current value of this $50 per ton case, where you can see the P50 is just at about negative 5% on the IRR. So even at the $100 per ton case, so coming back to this red line, we actually see positive return only within the P10 values starting here, where we get to finally see a 10% rate of return or higher, which is still not great considering those are your P10 values. You'd like to see those a little higher. In the federal case to $170 per ton, things do look significantly better with a P50 IRR of just under 15%. But again, at the current $50 per ton or even $75 per ton case, we rarely see an economically viable project, as they all kind of sit behind that line there. After we ran the probabilistic distribution against the inputs that you see in the bottom right tornado diagram, so that's these distribution inputs that we risked, being the capital cost, fixed cost, or fixed OPEX cost, as well as the variable OPEX cost. So after we ran our distribution against those parameters that Jodi had highlighted earlier, the $75 per ton carbon credit scenario was still only providing a return over 5% in the top 20% of cases. So that's what we're looking at down here. Again, the remaining 80% of cases were less than 5%, or even some within the negative if you look up here. So unsurprisingly, we essentially conclude that with current post-combustion capture technology and current carbon credit values, the ownership and operatorship of the full CCS value chain with a traditional post-combustion system or solvent-based system is largely uneconomic, at least at the scale of this 1.25 million ton per year injection capacity that we're evaluating. So just to provide a little more context to this case, the per ton CO2 value to capture and sequester that ton of CO2 for our mean case. So when we first derived all of our estimates and we came up with our mean base case, that equated to about $80 per ton. So in this case, at a post-combustion capture, to then capture it, dehydrate it, put it at pressure, send it through the pipeline, inject it, send it through the whole value chain, that costs about $80 per ton. So the approximate composition of that $80 per ton value was that about $55 was associated with the development and operation of the capture facilities, and then about $25 per ton was associated with all the pipeline, injection, storage side of the value chain. So really what we do there is we focus in on reducing the costs of the capture technology as being the really important focus for enhancing CCS economics under this kind of case. Where our model considers a $55 per ton as the capture specific costs with a typical post-combustion solvent system, there are companies like we mentioned earlier, being Entropy, for example, that are developing more optimized systems at around $30 USD per ton, according to the latest investor deck. So really what we're saying here is that given current technology and given current carbon credit values, you likely wouldn't allocate your capital here without a significant reduction in capture costs or an increase in the carbon credit value. And here's an overview of case B, but just along the NPV10 and payback time distributions, where as expected, a similar story is being told. We're only seeing positive P50 NPV10s in the high-end carbon credit value cases, which is illustrated by that purple line there, which is the $170 per ton escalated case. Same story goes for payback time distribution, where you're really only getting a relatively acceptable P10 payback time in the $170 per ton case. And so we are on to case C, where we're now looking at a completely different capture application. Now we're looking at analyzing a pre-combustion capture system on a hydrogen manufacturing unit. Specifically, we're looking at a steam methane reformer with a net capture rate of about 85% CO2 recovery. And we are, again, still including the full downstream infrastructure of transportation and storage that we included in case A and as well as case B. So this is really looking at the full value chain to produce hydrogen as well as capture the associated CO2 and send that into the storage hub. You can also note that we've noted that this is a chemically based capture system versus post-combustion. So just trying to highlight those main differences there. On the revenue side of things, we're now including the value add commodity of blue hydrogen within the revenue stream. So the ability to produce and sell that blue hydrogen is now worked into our cases or our scenarios, in addition to the carbon credits that we're going to receive for decarbonizing the hydrogen production itself. And so our scenarios are driven by a combination of hydrogen sale price and carbon credit value, and we managed to narrow it down to 8. So looking on the lower end of the scale, we have a $1 per kilogram hydrogen sale price within an environment of $75 per ton carbon credit value, moving up to a $2 per ton or $2 per kilogram hydrogen price, again in a $75 carbon credit value, where I would actually say scenario 7 is what's representative of today's market in Alberta, where about $2 per kilogram of hydrogen is your approximate sale price for blue hydrogen. And like I said, we are operating in a $50 carbon credit market. So there's a number of different scenarios going on here where we do have the two different parameters of hydrogen price and carbon credit value. Let's just start by looking at a singular scenario. This is scenario number 4 on that last slide, with $1.50 as the hydrogen price and $75 as the carbon credit. With the value add commodity of hydrogen in the revenue stream and the ability to capture that CO2 at lower costs with the pre-combustion system, we now see much stronger economic cases than what we saw previously in the post-combustion CCS value chain example, or case B. If you recall that in our previous $75 per ton carbon credit case without blue hydrogen, we had a P50 value of about negative 400. So that was this value here in case B was looking more at negative $400 million. Whereas here now with the value added blue hydrogen in the economics, as well as the cost optimization for pre-combustion capture and storage, our P50 is more at the $152 million level. So a significant increase in economics. You can also see in the bottom right tornado diagram that the inputs that we're risking have now changed a little bit from the last two examples. So now we're running our probabilistic distribution against capital and fixed OPEX costs like we were before, but now we're actually also including the gas price and running the variance on that. And that's the gas price as the input feedstock natural gas to produce hydrogen. Variable OPEX costs are also still included here. And we just wanted to point out that the variable OPEX costs are the biggest contribution pieces to those are power and steam generation. And so here we've overlaid two more scenarios as to show how different hydrogen prices can impact the project economics, but at a static carbon credit value. So in this model and in the previous blue hydrogen models that we've done, we do consistently see that hydrogen price has a larger impact on project economics than the carbon credit value. So we can see quite significant jumps in the P50 NPV10 returns here, going from about negative $400 million in the $1 per kilogram hydrogen case, all the way up to a positive nearly $200 million NPV10 in the $1.50 per kilogram hydrogen case. And if you're able to get $2 per kilogram of hydrogen in a scenario of $75 per ton carbon credit, you see quite positive economics at a $600 million or so NPV10 return over the 25-year project life. So the higher impact that hydrogen price and the margin that you can make on your hydrogen compared to the value of the carbon credit, since the hydrogen price itself has a higher impact on project economics, we see this as a welcome source, a welcome news to the operators out there who are actually able to have control over optimizing low-cost blue hydrogen production and taking ownership of that high-impact piece of the economic puzzle. Whereas if hydrogen production and associated carbon capture were much more heavily reliant on the carbon credit value, then their economics is more out of their control. So here we wanted to show some scenarios with the static hydrogen price of $1.50 per kilogram hydrogen and varying carbon credit values. So this is the opposite of what we just looked at. Now our hydrogen price remains steady and the variance comes from the credit values. So you can already see that the $1.50 per kilogram hydrogen price, we have no negative NPV 10 cases, right? Everything's above that zero line. So we're already off to a better start than the low case in the last example. Again, this is because the hydrogen price is more impactful as an economic driver on the project cases. So appointing a relatively decent hydrogen price of $1.50 per kilogram means that our mean case, or it kind of means that we're already looking pretty good comparatively to the last economic review where we had hydrogen prices in the $1 range. And so they just kind of keep getting better as carbon credit values increase, going from a P50 NPV 10 in the $75 per ton carbon credit case of just under $200 million, which is here. Sorry, this is the $75 case at $200 million. You increase your carbon credit value to 100 and you jump to this P50 return of about $400 million over project life. And if you put $1.50 per kilogram hydrogen sale price in line with the federal projection of $170 carbon credit, you look to get really, really great economic returns within that scenario in particular of just under a $1 billion return over the project life. And so here's a convergence in overall economics based on the balancing act of hydrogen price and value of the carbon credit. So we found this was really interesting as we ran our scenarios. The scenarios that are lining up to give you very similar economics and very similar probability distributions here is a scenario of a $1 per kilogram hydrogen sale price in a 170 ton per ton carbon credit world, so that federally projected world by 2030, the high case. However, you get almost the exact same or very similar economics if you're working with $1.50 per kilogram hydrogen price and $100 carbon credit. And then the same thing kind of goes that your economic case looks extremely similar when you're working with a $2 per kilogram hydrogen price in a $50 carbon credit scenario, which is very kind of reflective of today's environment. So ultimately, it looks like it's going to be a balancing act in reducing CCS and hydrogen production costs alongside the setting of an optimal carbon credit value. That balancing act is kind of going to dictate a lot of how the market price for Alberta-based blue hydrogen ends up being forecast, and it'll probably dictate a lot of what government sees as an appropriate carbon credit value within the hydrogen space. And here's just a blast of all 8 of our blue hydrogen cases overlaid on the same MPV10 distribution table. We see our cluster here in the middle, where those combinations of hydrogen price and carbon credit values really converge to create some level of market parity across the different cases. And then we see that in our cases with the higher hydrogen price, so these green lines here of $1.50 and the red lines of $2, within the relatively higher hydrogen price, those economics are much more secure. Again, we rarely see them come below the $0 range, only sort of in the lower cases here, for the green lines being $1.50. So yeah, they have much more secure economics. You got a lot more wiggle room, so to speak, when your hydrogen margin is higher. In the $1 per kilogram hydrogen cases, so we're looking at the blue lines now, they again rely much heavier on having a very high carbon credit value. You can see the only profitable scenario for $1 per kilogram hydrogen case ends up being when you have $170 carbon credit value. It's kind of hidden here in the background. The IRR distribution tells a very similar story, right? So when you have a low hydrogen price, you're relying on a higher carbon credit value. And intuitively, if you do have a lower hydrogen price and you're only able to get a low amount of value for your hydrogen, it's most likely because that hydrogen is able to be produced at low cost, which is probably because there's a high carbon credit value contributing to that. So that's the intuitive logic we try to use here, right? If you are getting $1 per kilogram of your hydrogen, you actually are likely probably in this higher carbon credit value world. That's why the hydrogen sale price is so low, and vice versa, right? If you're charging more for your hydrogen, it's probably because you're not getting as much support in the way of carbon credits. And here is what we wanted to finish with on the economic side, just to show sort of an independent source that supports our mean estimates and gives us a bit of a benchmark. So as we said, we source much of our cost data from our internal database, but also from a lot of public sources, such as the Alberta Quest annual summary reports, Alberta Carbon Trunkline annual summary reports. We also looked at a number of white papers, both from the States as well as here at the University of Alberta. So we kind of sourced our cost data on a line item by line item basis, but they all roll up to be relatively verified within this IEA 2021 levelized cost of capture, where we kind of see the power generation of natural gas fired sources falling within the $50 to $100 range. Ours in this case, like we said, was kind of riding around the $80 per ton overall range for full capture and sequestration. And then hydrogen down here, you see it coming in at slightly lower, giving you that higher concentration of CO2, which kind of results in various cost savings throughout the value chain. So we just want to kind of clue up here to show that we've seen our evaluations sort of be verified, so to speak, or benchmark. And some conclusions here along the side. CO2 capture remains the highest individual CCS component that we need to address to improve the economics. It is quite difficult with current post-combustion technology, but that seems to be an area where there's a lot of interest in industry in improving and optimizing. Less so on the chemical process side of things, where pre-combustion tends to provide some cost increases for optimization and gives you that higher concentration, higher purity level of CO2 through the value chain. Again, this is an important point. All of our evaluations excluded the clean fuel regulation and tax incentive credits. So those would obviously benefit the overall economic cases quite significantly depending on how they roll out. And the last point we wanted to show here is that the Shell Quest, they have publicly stated that the costs for their project, or capital costs for their project, would be reduced by 20 to 30% if done again today. So this is an area that's moving and advancing quickly, and we're seeing scale and cost reductions from that.
Okay, thank you, Devin. Before I move off this slide too, I just want to make one note here on the very top item on this chart, the direct air capture. This is obviously a growing area of importance. I think that there's a lot of money being spent on. On that front, there was big news in late 2021 in the news. A quote read, "World's largest plant capturing carbon from the air starts in Iceland." You dig into the details and they talk about 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. Not 4 million tons, but 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. So that's the annual equivalent of about 790 cars is what it says in the press release. So there is a steep learning curve to scale this up and deliver on scale and delivering on costs as well too. So my point here isn't to beat down technology, just to highlight really that much remains on the R&D front there to make it commercial and scalable. So we've talked about the costs. Now we've captured it. Now what do we do with the CO2 now that we have it? What about the storage space? There's a quote here that I like from the University of Alberta. Rick Chelternick said, the reality is we need to do this at scale, but solving a problem, in our atmosphere is no good if we just create a different problem inside the planet. And so what he's really getting at is that the whole idea of sequestration, permanently putting CO2 into a subsurface geological storage, it's not as simple as just set it and forget it. There's real science around it. And so it obviously is a convenient solution, but we do need to dig a little bit deeper into it to understand it properly. So what we show on this slide here now is GLJ's attempt to show some analytical tools and then ultimately into a 3D dynamic model of the CCS Quest project, where we take the CO2 and sequester it in the subsurface, and then we track its behavior and its plume movement in the saline aquifers. The verification and storage capacity and containment is really required to build out any sort of development project that you need to propose to the government. Ultimately, once it's operational, these simulation tools also give us a way to monitor the information and track, in fact, that the CO2 is being sequestered permanently. So what did we do with it? We've identified the key model parameters, such as the structure, thickness, porosity, etc., in the Quest area of interest. Once that model's there, it allows us for simple modifications to utilize this type of a model across the WCSB. As mentioned, the BCS, the Cambrian sand where the saline aquifer is, it's not the same everywhere. So we'll need to adjust for localized issues. But once it's built, it does allow us to match the prediction runs that were chosen by Shell for the CCS plume movement, and to show the pressures and to validate the history match in the model setup. Now with that model built, you have the ability to predict plume movement in the subsurface for hundreds of years. And on the right, it's just a simple graphic that kind of shows the density of CO2 as you move it in depth and pressure. And there obviously is a bit of a critical point there at around 800 meters, just shy of 1,000 meters, where you really do begin to liquefy the CO2 and make it much more dense. So here's just a couple slides that show the model setup. This, as I mentioned before, is quite a large area of interest across the east-west, north-south side of this area of interest. We've modeled the structure top and the thickness. We've taken the new modern wells that have been built there to help hang the structure and the geological setup onto it. From here, we've obviously used the log determined parameters, porosities, rock quality to construct the subsurface model. Average parameters that we've shown before are detailed here. And again, this is a nice thick sand that we're going to be looking to inject into. What does this look like inside of Petrel? There's a little bit of uncertainty in the distribution of those parameters, so we've tried to capture some of that. Initially, we made this full-size model. As described, it's a very large area. We ended up with nearly 29 million cells, which took about 20 hours to run, which is a little bit not feasible to model these things and effectively get a history match. So we used what's commonly used, which is this sort of a tartan grid, where you have a much more dense grid pattern over the area of interest and slightly less dense as you move away from it. And then that allowed us to have much more realistic run times. And so for people who are comfortable and understand simulation models, you really have two types of parameters. Those that you tell the model, and in this case we're telling it now what the injection rates were in reality, and then you have parameters that become modeled parameters that you now compare against those measurements as taken in the area of interest. So in this case, we have injection rates at the 3 wells. Those are shown down here. and in aggregate again at the top. And on the right-hand side, we now have injection pressures, which are, we'll tell it at the surface what we're injecting at, and then we monitor to see what the subsurface pressures are. And now in reality, Shell as operator has a number of pressure gauges, obviously, at the surface and subsurface, and we can see the quality of the match that we've provided to it. So once we have an appropriate quality of match that we're happy with, it allows us to move from this period, which is the historical data, into a longer term period of injection, which is really just the average expected rate that we inject into this horizon over the next 20 years. So with that in mind, we do each of those in the wells that we're looking at. And then it does allow us obviously to see how the pressure changes in the future and what happens to the CO2 plume. So we now inject for 5 years, and then we shut it in for 100 years to see what it looks like. Then we'll inject for 25 years, which is expected to be the end of life of the facility. And then we monitor it at 100 years, and then furthermore for 500 and 1,000 years. So what does that look like in a graphical sense? So here's time zero, if you will. We started injection in 2015 here. On this side, we simply show a map or a plan view. This is obviously a cross-sectional view. Now note that the thickness is greatly magnified here. It's much larger east to west. I think the scale that's shown there is roughly 18 kilometers on that plot. And as we know, the thicknesses shown on the left-hand side are only about 40 meters in that thickness of zone. So, but that does allow us to see the change in variations much easier. But either way, at the beginning of time, what we're showing here is CO2 saturation, and it's zero across the whole formation. So now, current, we ran this in December of 2021. So we captured the actual volumes that had been injected into each of these 3 wells at that point in time. And now you see the resulting plume, both in the map view on the left and the cross section on the right. As expected, the CO2 saturation is very high near the wellbore where we're injecting, decreases as we move away. It's simply just showing the plume moving away from the wellbore. And you do start to see even early indications of the buoyancy effect here, where the CO2 saturations are actually higher up in the structure and lower down in the structure simply as the gas and the water begin to re-equilibrate. Now you move out to time 2040, which is the projected end of injection at Quest. So at this point, we've injected 25 to 30 million tons of CO2. You see the volumes as they accumulate around the 3 wells. And you also see how they move out aerially away from those well locations, to the point yet where these 3 wells really aren't interacting with each other yet. There's still quite a large area between each of these where the CO2 saturation is still essentially zero. Now, if we stop injection and we simply let the model run out in time, what you're really seeing here now is the buoyancy impact. The CO2 is simply moving up structurally from the deeper parts of the reservoir up higher into the structure, primarily again right around the wellbores, but you do see them spreading out aerially in those 2 directions as well too. So again, that's at 50 years. I'll flip through it quickly. Here's at 500 years, and ultimately at 1,000 years. Well past injection. Does show full, obviously we've built this with a strong seal at the top, does show strong containment, right? Extremely low CO2 saturations, even out at that point, which is only, let's say roughly 2 to 3 kilometers to the east of that well. What you do note as well too is that due to the tilt here, which again is magnified, there's a little bit higher CO2 saturations up to the northeast of this formation relative to the southwest, which makes sense. We know that that's the overall tilting of the basin here. So again, the model is very helpful here and helps really prove the case in point of both seal and long-term sequestration in the project. Now, we'll step off that a little bit into a slightly unrelated topic as we come to the end here. But obviously, as we develop these storage reservoirs, they have value. In the same way that oil or a gas reservoir has value to a producing company. So what we use is the SPE SRMS, which is the Storage Resource Management System, which will look very similar to those who work on the oil and gas side, which is the PRMS, which is used to quantify oil and gas reserves. We now have utilized a very similar structure to calculate storage capacities. So what we see here now, this was published in 2017, and as noted, it really is important to help establish the consistency of the resource language and improve communication between those who are very intimate with the subject and those who might not be up the value chain, give a common language across the way. So instead of reserves, we would now talk about capacity resources. We'll have proved volumes, very similar to what we would in the reserve and resource world, probables and possibles. We could have contingent storage resources, which again are in discovered and known reservoirs, and we might have prospective storage resources, which are in reservoirs that are yet to be discovered. So again, we don't spend much time on it. Link is provided here for further reading. But again, I think this is something that will have importance of value going forward in the future. And it is an area, for example, where GLJ does work with our clients to help them quantify the value of those storage resources. Now, last couple slides to wrap up. Looking long term, we really feel that we need the contribution from all types of energy to meet future demand, and really with a focus on more sustainable energy systems. The dominant technologies, we believe, will just be driven by the geography, the costs, and the public policy. Public policy, likewise, will be heavily influenced by the industry's ability to maintain sustainability efforts in their development. Such as I'm saying is if we've got the ability to deliver energy at a very reliable and sustainable manner, that will influence the public policy that's built around it. So for example, Western Canada and many of the areas of the United States have a lot of the energy sources that are shown here in this cartoon. We've got small scale hydroelectric. Clearly, we've got solar, we've got wind in all of our areas, we've got substantial natural gas infrastructures, we have geothermal opportunities, etc. All of these are apparent in areas that are kind of blessed with them, and some are more strong with some relative to others. But I really do think it's the combination of all of those that will drive economic and sustainable energy going forward. And I think both Canada and the U.S. energy industry have world-leading standards, on environmental, human rights, ethical standards, and worker safety. So we're really well positioned to move towards this net zero future as the global suppliers of choice. And again, North American industry is recognized as world leaders. And I think we should be proud of that. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. I'll flip to our last slide. Thanks, Devin, for your time and presentation here today. And thanks to all of those at GLJ behind the scenes who put in a lot of effort putting together this information and helping us out today. And thanks to the companies who gladfully and willfully share their technical information at conferences and presentations, such as Shell, CNR Quest, Enhance, Entropy, etc. So thanks again. And thanks to SAGA Wisdom for giving us this forum and letting us preach to the choir a little bit. So thanks again.